Occupational therapy and speech therapy are types of rehabilitation that help people develop or regain important skills. Occupational therapy helps a person becomes more independent in everyday activities, while speech therapy helps with communication. How do these therapies work? Professor Julius Ademokoya, a professor of speech language and hearing education, Rehabilitation Department of Special Education, University of Ibadan, will speak to us. Prof, thank you so much for joining us on Insights.
It's my pleasure to be here. Good afternoon, listeners.
Thank you so much. Now tell us, how do these therapies work?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start by saying that occupational therapy and speech language therapy belong to the entire rehabilitation program. The fact is that, just like you mentioned, the occupational therapy does a lot in helping individuals who have health challenges, disability, and so on. The fact is that after the medical doctors would have done the necessary curative process of any patient, there would still be some need. Take, for instance, somebody who sustained accidents, who had accidents, and in the process of having that, probably had injuries that has to be healed up by the medical doctors. But then, after the medical doctor would have done, his or her own part, the need to take care of the physical disability left over by the accident now comes to the service of occupational therapists. There will definitely be the need, one, to optimize functioning. In the process of accident, for instance, the injury may go beyond just having some, injury to the flesh. There could be amputation and so on. The fellow may become a disabled individual, having problems in moving just as he was moving before, or there could be situations where he could become so motionless, except somebody assisting, to see which sorts of assistive device should be brought in. How would the working environment or living environment of that individual be remodeled in such a way that, as much as possible, that individual can have what we call self-independence in terms of mobility and doing some things. He wouldn't have to become entirely redundant or somebody living on somebody else before he or she can do, self-help or even carry on his occupation. Now, in case of speech therapist, of course, you know that communication is quite very important to all human beings. In fact, God has designed it in such a way that out of all animals, let me put it that way, especially the mammals, is the human being that has been able to develop, language into such factor that it can be used for communication, sharing idea, for emotional purposes, for receiving information, and also for expressing information. Everybody knows that in our individual life, communication is very, very important. And when you have an individual who is challenged in that area, his or emotional problems, isolation, and all kinds of, being set apart, having difficulty in reaching others, will become so heavy upon him that may even lead to other health problems.
Are they different from sensory integration therapy?
Well, there are some differences, and at times there are also areas where the two align. When you talk about speech disorders, you may also have to look at what sense or senses that are involved. For somebody not to be able to hear, for instance, that fellow must have had his or her hearing sense heavily impaired. So the sense of hearing comes in that case. Maybe as a result of accident or illness, somebody loses his sight. Then the sense of sight, comes in that situation. So you then find out that, well, if for whatsoever reason somebody has lost his sight or his hearing and cannot be cured, cannot be recovered, of course, we then bring in the occupational therapy or speech therapy process of rehabilitation. How do we teach or train this individual to readapt to a new life? Take, for instance, somebody who has lost his sight, and yet maybe the person is still at his prime age. He cannot be left alone. What can be done? Of course, that takes us to the realm of special education at times, or even at times still within the occupational therapy. What other rehabilitative measure can we adopt? Somebody who has lost the hearing can still be taught, how to read through the brain process, for instance. Just as somebody who has lost his hearing can be helped, with some audiological devices like hearing aids and so on. So you find out that there is a very tiny, line in between the sensory um, and then occupational therapy or speech language therapy of sorts.
Really, what speech and language problems can speech therapy address, especially in children?
We have that, some which are very peculiar with children, and then we have some which can come up at any stage of life, maybe acquired or as a result of developmental progressive issues. Then we have that such that can be as a result of aging, because as we grow old, some of our systems, some of our senses also some sort of getting weak, maybe as a result of degenerative, body system. Now, back to your question, like you ask, speech problems peculiar to children. There are many. Take, for instance, we have what we call delay language or delay speech,
Okay.
whereby a child may not be able to acquire speech skills relevant or peculiar to certain age. For instance, when a child is born, a child comes with what we call reflexive vocalization. In other words, one of the signs that parents or nurses will look for in a living child when it's born is that child must cry. But at times, the child may delay a bit, and even if the child cries eventually, what happens the first 3 months? What happened in the next 6 months? What happened in the next 9 months? Then what happened at exactly when the child is 1 year? The fact is that all those that I've mentioned, that timelines that I've mentioned, are called language development milestones. Okay, there is a time a child is supposed to babble, produce certain letters. Like you have a child who is about 3 months, 4 months, it's saying pronouncing ba ba ba, da da da, and so on. Giving some specific isolated syllables. Then that child goes on to echolalia, is now being able to hear. He could hear the parents around him. He could hear siblings around him, making some common words. You see the child eventually beginning to repeat them. We develop speech by imitating, causing of the sense of hearing. Now, on to 1 year, when the child will start to develop what we call true speech. In other words, the child begin to speak, according to the language, commonly spoken around him or her. The fact is that not every child is always able to follow that trend. A child learns how to speak because he hears somebody speaking, and he enjoys the love of speaking. He or she makes some signs and the parents repeats. We also have what we call stammering or stuttering. It's a childhood speech development characterized by unnecessary repeating, the first letter. In fact, the child may have delay in saying the first letter. Then there could also be some that are due to, sensory defects. Like you mentioned earlier, the issue of hearing loss, for instance, a child who has hearing loss will definitely not be able to speak because speaking is a product of hearing. We, first of all, are able to hear before we begin to assimilate what we have heard, then internally begin to process what we've heard, and then eventually speaking out. Speech development is broadly divided to two. Number one is that you have what we call receptive speech, a time where the child, keeps hearing and internalizing what is heard. Now, when the child would have developed to a certain stage, the child then begin to produce. That is, expressive stage of speech. But then all these things are made possible because that child has hearing facility working. But if the child is not hearing, there's no way he's going to hear anything. There's no way he's going to internalize anything. There's no way he's going to learn how to speak or repeat, what is heard. So that is a serious sensory problems associated with hearing loss. There is also the issue of the mental underdevelopment involved with the hearing. Of course, for a child to develop language or speech normally and for him to do very well, he must have good, intelligent quotient, sufficient intelligent quotient required for learning how to speak.
Now that Nigeria is actually racing to meet the target of WHO on rehabilitation and recovery, what is Nigeria doing and how do we go about rehabilitation and recovery for persons with occupational needs when it comes to rehabilitation and speech?
Well, Nigeria has keyed into what we call Rehabilitation 2030, which the WHO initiated in 2017. And the idea is to strengthen the rehabilitation service or services and make sure that it becomes a recognized and a functional part of what we call universal health coverage. Now, of course, Nigeria has also initiated the Rehabilitation 2030 working a kind of think tank group, which of course I'm one of them. So we have also started, working. The issue of rehabilitation to 2030 has certain guide to follow. Assessing the situation of rehabilitation in Nigeria, for instance, we've started that. We've tried to see what, is the state of rehabilitation services vis-a-vis different programs that are involved in rehabilitation. Audiology, for instance, speech pathology, occupational therapy, prosthetics and orthotics. This thing, at what stage are they? Looking at the education, for instance, what are we doing with the training of speech therapists, for instance, audiologists, for instance, occupational therapists, for instance? So we've started assessing. And of course, as we are also doing that, Nigeria does not, exist in isolation. We just have to align with what obtains at the international scene. We're also collaborating with other international bodies, especially the WHO. And again, we are also looking into certain areas. Don't forget that in the recent time, the Minister of Education inaugurated a committee that will see to the teaching, the training, the adoption of the curriculum for speech language therapy, as well as occupational therapy in 20 Nigerian universities. What led to that was because the statistics showed that that we do not have sufficient occupational therapists in Nigeria. We don't have sufficient speech language therapists in Nigeria. I heard Dr. Mrs. Amum the other time saying that there are just 150 occupational therapists in Nigeria to serve over 200 million people. Ditto for the language therapy too. We have less than 200, speech language therapists in the country to serve over 200 million Nigerians. So what do we do? Of course, we have to boost the education of occupational therapists and language, speech language therapists, which luckily, I also belong to that committee inaugurated by the minister.
Professor Julius Abiola Ademokoya, I want to thank you so much for joining us on Insight, and thank you for your contributions. We do appreciate your time.
It's my pleasure. Thank you very much.